Yep, we're good.
Great. Good evening, everyone. I'd like to welcome you all to the third ward boundary and council structure review. The meeting is going to be live streamed tonight. So if anyone has a problem having their face on live stream, you can always turn your camera off. But just wanted to announce that that is being done. And this is the third public consultation and discussion of three, and we were happy that our consultants were able to add a third one to accommodate the extra people tonight. Councillors are here just listening in, and council will be discussing and debating results and our own opinions on the Tuesday, February 16th meeting of council. So without further ado, welcome, John. Begin your presentation.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor. And thank you, Sarah, for organizing this. I'm just going to share my screen so you can see the presentation here. I'm hoping you are all seeing a large green slide that says Town of Grimsby on it. My name's John Matheson, and I'm here with my colleague, Olivia Lahi, and together we'll be taking you through the presentation. I think there's about 12 or 13 members of the public who are participants here tonight, which is a great number, honestly, and I'm really delighted that you're here. This really is one of those more the merrier type situations, but what it does mean is that we're going to have to be particularly careful to be polite to one another and make sure that everybody gets a chance to be heard. This is a workshop. It's not a deputation. So there isn't going to be sort of 5 minutes of speeches where you sort of go ahead. What I'll do is I'll take you through a series of questions that are focused on different aspects of the review, because as you are probably aware, if you've taken a look at some of the materials on the website, and I'd encourage you to do so if you hadn't had a chance, there's a number of different specific aspects of this where the best way to actually get your creative juices flowing, but also to make sure that we get everybody's input in an organized structure, is to take them one question at a time. So please don't jump ahead and give all of your answers about everything all at once, because it's actually really important for the flow of the workshop that we stay one question at a time. Because we're at the upper end of what's going on, I'm going to make my comments briefer to allow that there's as much time as possible. But you know, when you're thinking or budgeting time, we're supposed to take about 2 hours, and to give everybody a chance to speak, divided over the various time, you're going to want to make sure that you're not going on too long, or either the meeting will go on endlessly, or we won't have a chance to accommodate everybody. So let me dive in. Oh, sorry, there's one other thing I should mention. I can see you, and so if you go like this, then I know you want to speak. As you know, it's Zoom, so there's also a little function where you can put up your hand if you'd like to speak. Just remember to turn your speaker on when I recognize you. Generally speaking, if your camera's on, then I can see you and you'll be relatively near the top. If you haven't spoken or had your camera on for a while, you may drift down to the bottom of the list. So if you're trying to make yourself heard or seen and you can't, please just turn your microphone on when there's a moment of pause and say, I've been trying to get in. It's certainly not my intention to exclude anybody, but you probably have the same thing. I can see about 16 different boxes of faces and names. And so if your speaker isn't on and if your camera isn't on, I don't know if you want to speak or not. But so hopefully we can accommodate everybody and get through and have what has proven to be in all the past meetings a very enjoyable conversation about a really important subject. So let me dive in. Tonight, what we're going to talk about is the introduction and rationale for why one does a council structure and ward boundary review. We'll start off digging into the council structure and electoral options for how big the council might be structured and how we would go about to elect members of council. Then we'll get into the very important concept of effective representation, discuss the current ward populations of your existing wards, and at the end there'll be some leftover time for anything that we haven't been able to cover. But that's the broad agenda. So we'll start with the structure and then we'll get into the wards. To dive right in, I'll just give you a bit of background. And a lot of this content is available in video format on demand on the website. So if you have to duck out, if you're watching at home, or if you want to follow up and hear it in greater detail later, you can always take a look at the Grimsby website, where under the ward boundary and council structure review, and you'll find there's a lot of information there. Let's just dive right into the council structure review. I mean, obviously, you know that your local government's important. Otherwise, you wouldn't be taking a couple of hours on a weeknight to participate in this. The town of Grimsby provides important services to residents, whether those be things like roads or fire protection or parks. You know, literally dozens of services that matter to us every day. Local government matters. The people who lead that local government are your elected council. And council's got a mayor and 8 councillors who are elected every 4 years. Now, a mayor is elected at large, meaning that every eligible voter is entitled to cast a vote in that election. And there are 4 wards. So each ward in Grimsby elects 2 councillors. Now, Grimsby also is represented at the Niagara Regional Council by the mayor and by 1 regional councillor who is also elected at large. So everybody gets to vote for them. It's not done by ward. But Grimsby's representation on Niagara Regional Council isn't part of this review. That would be a matter for the region to lead. It isn't a matter for me under my terms of reference. So we're here to focus on the 8 councillors who make up the council plus the mayor. So a review of council structure and ward boundaries. The council structure aspect of it focuses on how many councillors and how they're going to be elected. The ward boundaries focuses on ensuring that ward boundaries continue to provide a system of effective and equitable representation. Now we do this, we don't try and do it once and for all time, and yet we don't want it to be out of date next week either. And so the purpose of the review is to provide options that can accommodate and have a fair and appropriate system that will be able to manage not just today, but also the growth for the next 10 years, which would cover the 2022, 2026, and 2030 municipal elections. So we're looking for something that's going to work and be effective for about 10 years. And that's a really important point, because I'm sure you're all aware, Grimsby's growing. And so you need to have something that won't just work based on the numbers and the location of people today, but to also have that work over time. And as you probably know, the next election is going to be held in October of 2022. So there's a real relevance to what we're talking about tonight, because this review is going to set the structure of council and the shape and number of wards for that election. So that's important. So simply, why conduct this review? Well, Grimsby hasn't had an independent review and a big public consultation on the ward structure for 27 years. So since 1993. And I just finished mentioning that, you know, this system is supposed to last for 10. Well, your last one lasted for 27 years, which isn't bad. You know, the pace of growth is changing. Ward boundaries often have their roots in history, and they often reflect where people lived at the time the last review was done, how big the community was at the time the last boundaries were drawn. But as you know, communities are always growing and evolving. And as the population grows, what's common is that wards grow at a different rate. So that can throw the relative population of wards out of balance. And so the main purpose of the ward aspect of this review is to make sure that the ward boundaries and structure continue to provide a system of effective representation for all residents. Now you see that that's in quotes. We're going to talk about effective representation because those aren't just words that I use. That's actually a term that's been developed by the courts. And we'll talk about what it means and some of the principles that are behind it. Now, under the terms of reference, which are set by council, the process is led by Strategy Corp, that's my firm, which is an arm's length independent consulting team that was selected in an open competition. This is common. It's a significant feature of our system that it is common for municipalities to retain an independent consultant to manage the process in an exercise like this. So our job is to take a broad and comprehensive public consultation, meetings like this, as well as the online survey, which is and has been available for the last couple of weeks. We'll gather insights from existing members of council and interview stakeholders and the public. And ultimately, our job is to present options for the council to consider. It's council's role to make decisions. So the decision to make any changes in council structure or implement any new boundaries is going to be a decision of council, and it will go through the normal process of passing bylaws to implement any change. And it's expected that the process that would lead up to that decision will be complete by basically June of this year. So it's a quick process. We've been working on this together for the next 4 months or so. We started in December. Throughout the course, there'll be continuous updates and more information with respect to the project timeline and more reports as they become available. And they're going to be on the Let's Talk Grimsby project site, as well as the accessible through grimsby.ca. So the real important thing is that you're here. I really can't tell you how great it is. There's nothing worse than running one of these meetings and having no one to talk to. So it's actually great that you're here, but do plan to stay involved. This is only the first phase of public engagement. There's going to be a second as well. So the first round will be reporting on some of the initial aspects of the research. Then we'll come back in the first round. We'll report on mostly the council structure concepts that we've been hearing. And in the second round, we'll be actually coming back with more detailed recommendations about the design of wards. So this is very much a two-phased process. And there'll be a second round of consultation that'll be ongoing through the March-April period. So there's lots more. So you're on the front end of this important process. So that's pretty much it for the sort of the heavy background lecture component of this. The rest will be more interactive. So we'll get to test out and see how quick people are to, you know, it's not like Jeopardy. You don't have to phrase your comments in the form of a question or anything like that. Quite the opposite. I'll be the one asking the questions. But from now on, I'll be actually, with each slide, I'll typically be asking you for some feedback about specific things. So this first slide talks about the basic provincial rules of a council structural review. And so under the Municipal Act, which is like the guiding legislation for municipalities in Ontario, a municipality may review and set the size of its council. So that's where the authority is for council to do this. And there are certain rules that they have to follow. So the minimum allowable size of a municipal council is 5. So the smallest you can go is 5, which would be a mayor and 4 councillors. And you can have larger councils if you want. There's actually no ceiling on how big they can be. So as you know, down the 401 in Toronto, they've had 47 councillors. Right after Toronto's amalgamation, they had 56 councillors. So, but 5 is the minimum number. Now, another one of the basic rules is the head of council must be elected by the municipality at large. And there's basically 3 options for how councillors can be elected. By ward, which is what you're familiar with. So you divide the municipality up into pieces that are more or less equal in size, and you can elect them by ward, or you can elect them at large the way you elect the mayor. That is to say, everybody in Grimsby would have a vote for everyone. And in fact, if you had a council of 8, then each ballot would have room for voting up to your top preferred 8 candidates. So if there were 8 to elect, you'd all get to vote for all of them. And, you know, there might be 24 on the ballot, or there might just be 9. You can't tell until you see who signs up for it. There's also, you can do a combination of by ward and at large. That is typically done in municipalities where they're using that as a means of settling who the deputy mayor will be, or who will be a representative at county council. And of course, that's not relevant here because, as I said, you're a representative to regional council. It's already set, it's by ward. But those are basically your 3 options. And I'm sorry, I actually have one more piece of background here before I get to asking you questions. So to just give you some context, this next slide, and I'm going to be asking you in a minute how you feel about the current size of council. But to give you some background, the current estimated population for Grimsby is around 30,000 right now. So what we did was we took a list of Ontario municipalities with populations between 21 and 51,000. that gives you the sense of ones that are a little bit smaller and ones that are a little bit bigger. And we kind of stuck Grimsby more or less in the middle. And this first slide shows how you stack up against other municipalities in terms of how large your council is compared to them. And as you can see, that of the 30 that we took a look at that are, of comparable size, a little bit bigger and a little bit smaller, 9 of them have councils of 9, like Grimsby. So that's sort of squarely a third. And just a little bit more than that have councils of 7. So the next most common size is 7. Now, as you can see, there's another 9 on the list, and they're all over the place in ones and twos. They range from 5 all the way up to 16. There's no actual hard and fast rule that says you must have an odd number of councillors, but it's quite beneficial to have an odd number of councillors because it's handy because you've got a means of breaking the tie in the vote. But as you can see, there are living, breathing municipalities that have even numbers of council or even numbers of representatives on council, including the mayor. So there's one with 6 and one with 8 and one that's 10, and they make it work. But 7 and 9 are the 2 most common. So let's have a go and see how we do in terms of accommodating people's first round of comments. And to give you an idea, I'm going to be asking you about the size of council. Then later on the next one, I'm going to ask you about what your preferred method of electing them is. And then we're going to get into and then we're going to get into how many per ward. So those are the 3 questions I'm going to be asking you about this. So we need to pace ourselves a little bit. And then we'll get into the ward design stuff, the principles around effective representation, how big they are now, and your comments or recommendations about guidance to us about how we might want to think about redrawing them. So that's what's going to come next. That's your kind of outline for the rest of the presentation. Now I see Marilyn has a question.
Thank you, John. I'm just wondering, are all of these representatives who are elected, are they full-time or a combination of full and part-time?
So I guess they're considered part-time.
They're all considered part-time. Okay, thank you.
So how do you feel, and by the way, that's just what Marilyn did, waving your hand so I can see you, that is perfect. If I can see you, I can say go ahead. So what do you think? Do you have any thoughts? And it's okay if you don't. Do you have any thoughts on the current size? Whether you think it's perfect the way it is, or whether you think it would be better if it were larger, or if you think it would be better if it were smaller. Do you have any thoughts? Bud?
Yeah, basically, the size, I think, is fine.
Okay. I want to introduce you to my friend, the virtual yellow sticky. This is how I'm going to take notes, and you'll be able to see that I'm recording what it is you have to say. And the only request I have for you is if you think I haven't captured the essence of what it is you're trying to say, please just tell me. I'll be right with you, 009. It's just important to me that I get it right, and I'll consider it a favor if you think, I won't consider it a correction or you being cross at me or something. It's important that the notes be right. So I'm sorry, I don't know what your name is, 524-009, but you're welcome to go ahead.
Yes, sorry, my name is Howard.
Thanks, Howard.
I'm just curious, the municipality that has 16 councillors, what is that one?
You know, I knew you'd ask that. I bet my colleague Olivia might be able to look it up while we're talking. I can't recall. I'm pretty sure it's a rural one, but she'll check it out. I think she's probably got the list handy.
Thanks.
Did you have any thoughts on size while you have the microphone?
Okay, I think the current size is quite adequate, but I would like, my feeling is I'd like to see the each ward smaller and only have 1 member. That's my.
We're going to get to that in just a second.
Okay.
But I'll make sure that I capture that feedback when we get to that one, because I try and sort it all in the right place. But we'll get to that. Other thoughts on size? If you're wanting me to see you and I just can't, oh, Jeff's iPad raised his hand. Go ahead.
Hi, this is Kristen Hans. I'm actually Jeff iPad's wife. I think council is slightly too large to reasonable in size. What I find strange is having 2 councillors in 1 ward.
You know what? I've got 2 comments now on the council per ward. So I'll tell you what, let me just jump ahead to the next 2 questions, and then we can look at comments on each of these things holistically, because Howard wanted to comment on that too. So hang on a sec. You see, even facilitators can be flexible sometimes. I'll just give you the background on this piece. This is how our other Ontario councils elected. And so we took the same 30, 21,000 and 51,000. And as you can see, 18 of the 30, the same 30 we looked at, use a ward system. 33 of them use an at-large system, and 2 of them use that combined system that we discussed. And the advantages of a ward system or the advantages of an at-large system are frankly something where there is no universal consensus. I've set them out there. I'm not going to read them at you because you can read them faster than I can speak. But you know, there's some people who swear by at-large systems because of their ability to encourage a broader municipal-wide view. There's others who swear by ward systems because they ensure that there's diverse representation from diverse areas within a community, and that you don't get any one heady concentration of population dominating the ultimate result. And you know, there's lots of other pros and cons. And frankly, if you read the academic literature, there is no unanimity of it. It's something that lots of people have different views on. So in a second, I'll ask you if you have any thoughts on this. And then the last one is the one that Howard and Kirsten wanted to talk about, which is how many councillors should there be per ward? And 2 is what you've got now. It's common to have 1. It's less common to have 3 per ward. And it's totally permissible to mix and match if that's what it takes to get the right representational balance. So what I'll do is, as I promised, I'm going to catch Howard's comment over here. And I think specifically, Howard, you said you prefer 1.
Yes, I prefer 1 ward, having 1 councillor. It makes for smaller wards, number 1, easier to look after, easier to manage, and the people, the constituents can focus on their 1 representative, and they can deal with 1 person, I think, more readily than 2.
And I think, Kirsten, that was your general direction too, because I promised I'd capture yours too.
Absolutely. Howard and I are in agreement.
Okay, good. And other comments on any of the 3 questions, either the council size or the method of election? I guess by your endorsement of the 1 per ward system, I guess that means you're preferring wards too, you guys, as opposed to at large, Howard and Kirsten.
Yes, I prefer 1. Well, all members be elected per ward. That because the best example of at-large systems in Canada is probably Vancouver, which is an absolute disaster. It has been for years. So I don't agree with at-large systems whatsoever. The councillors that are often voted in at-large systems become way too powerful, and there's a lot of more power struggles than ever before. So that's why I don't agree with it.
So can become too powerful. Other comments? Jennifer.
Sorry. Okay. I personally prefer the wards, and I prefer 2 per ward unless it was smaller wards. I like diverse representation. I think we might have a tendency to vote towards availability of the person, and you would eliminate a lot of women, working class, and I don't think everybody would be represented if that was happening. So like if you had somebody running that didn't have kids and you had somebody who did, you might be likely to vote the person without kids so they could dedicate more time to being on council. Those would be the things that I would be afraid of, with 1 per ward.
Okay. Other comments on any of the 3 questions? Marilyn.
Yeah, I think the geography matters. The ward boundaries are not particularly clear at the moment. You can't really differentiate which of the two counselors is accountable for you. And also, I think too, we're seeing concentrations of population growth based on the intensification. So if a ward has a portion is for intensification and a portion is rural or not, then that creates different dynamics in terms of how the electorate would choose to vote or how they'd like to see their ward. So there are other dynamics that are coming into play that we probably didn't have 20 years ago.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. Other comments? Bud?
I agree with the issue of diversity. You need, if you have one per ward, you don't have the chance of diversity within the ward.
And the boundaries need to change too.
Yeah, and the boundaries need to change.
We'll get to that. That's the whole second half.
Fine, okay.
Other comments? Oh, sorry, I see two hands that are up. Rita, I guess, first.
Thanks. I have to get myself off mute. I agree that it should be one per ward, but I think there should be smaller wards that really take into account the diversification. And that diversification includes not only, concentrated down in the town of Grimsby, but also up on the mountain. So there should be some representation for Upper Mountain.
I should just tell you, it was a little hard to hear you at the end. So I think what you were saying was that you were wanting to make sure that they were smaller wards and that there was adequate representation of particular areas, including the mountain. Is that what you were trying to say?
Yeah, including on the mountain, exactly.
And Jeff's iPad, that's Kirsten, right?
Jeff's here too. He just doesn't want to talk. We are relatively new to Grimsby. We have been watching Grimsby council meetings and participating. I think the thing that we find interesting is that I have not seen a lot of issues that are ward specific that would warrant a strictly ward structure. It seems like the issues that we're dealing with affect all of Grimsby. So perhaps a hybrid, one per ward plus two at large might represent the entire community in a different way and allow diversity while at the same time representation.
Okay. Hybrid. Sorry, you were saying two per ward and then some number of
one per ward. One per ward. I'm not a fan of two per ward.
Yeah.
But maybe two at large as a way to ensure diversity, because I definitely agree with the comment about diversity.
Okay. Need for diversity. Okay. I'll just mention it's a little harder for me to keep track of the hands, so don't get frustrated at me if I don't see them, because the waving hands are more visually grabbing than the little blue hands. So be patient with me if I miss you. You see, Annette is demonstrating the effectiveness of the waving hand. You're up, Annette.
Hello. I agree with what Jennifer is saying about the diversity is very important, especially for women that are working and want to have a say at the table. I'm not too sure about whether two per ward. I guess it really depends on the size of the ward. So just following this, I believe we're gonna talk about the actual ward boundaries in a minute, right?
Yeah, with maps and everything, so it'll be a lot easier. So not sure about the number per ward, depends on the size.
Yes.
What else? Who else we got here? And by the way, welcome, Jordan. We're kind of working our way through a series of questions, and feel free to jump in when you're comfortable. What we've just been talking about is whether you think the size of council is a good size, whether you think the way we elect them should be by ward or at large or by a mix, and how many councillors we should have per ward if we stick with wards. That's kind of the executive summary of where we're at so far. We still have a little time we can spend on this before we move on, so I don't have to charge ahead right away if there's people who haven't spoken on this yet. Oh, Adam.
Hi, I was just wondering, because you mentioned the hybrid system, how would that work exactly?
Where it works, it usually has one person who runs at large and the others elected by ward. And you have, so what that means that you have one councillor who has to basically pound a lot more pavement to get elected. So, so here, instead of say having roughly wards of say give or take 8,000 or 7,500, you'd have one councillor who has to get elected by all 30,000. And so that's why it's often used as a way of designating sort of a senior council position, like a person who will be a deputy mayor or a representative to the upper tier of municipal government. And in fact, that was probably that's sort of the thinking behind the system that you have, except you have a councillor who is a regional councillor who does not sit on your local council. One of the downsides with this approach is that it can create two tiers of council, because you somebody who could legitimately say, I had to get elected by the whole community, you didn't. But I did a ward boundary review in the town of Tecumseh, which is sort of like the Mississauga of Windsor. You know what, they might not like that. Let's say it's the Caledon of Windsor, but it's right on the edge of Windsor. And that's what they have. They have a deputy mayor who's elected at large.
Okay, thanks. I think I'll put a hand in for the ward system with the 2 councillors per ward. Just because of future growth, I think if, I don't know what the population will be in say 10 years, but I don't think we want to be at a point where there's too little councillors.
Adam, I got to ask, your mother isn't Margaret, is she?
I've heard the name before, though.
Former deputy minister, a very, very dignified public servant. Sorry, everybody else, I just had to ask. Prefer the 2-ward system, and I'm sorry, I was so excited by the fact that who I thought you might have been. That's 2 per ward, and that's in order to make sure that there is adequate representation in a growing system.
That's correct.
Any other comments on this? Because we can move on, because the playing with the maps is lots of fun. But I don't want to cut anybody off who hasn't spoken yet. Jordan, your big chance? Okay, I'll move on. You listen, anybody, you can tell I'm a pretty easygoing fellow, so we can always move back if we have to, if you catch up with something that we moved on from. So let me give you a bit of the introduction to effective representation, because these are the rules that have been developed by the court under the terms of reference provided to me by council. This is the test that we are supposed to apply in developing a system for you. So it's just useful for you to understand the considerations. It's almost like the software that guides the overarching system that we're required to use. So let me just explain it quickly, and then you can see what you think about it and how it applies to the wards as you understand them. So the Supreme Court of Canada has given us our best guidance on this. It comes out of a case called the Carter decision, which was a decision regarding the development of electoral boundaries in Saskatchewan back in the 80s. And these rules or principles have been further elaborated through a whole collection of decisions of the Ontario Municipal Board, which is now called the LPAD. There's 5 principles that have to be taken into consideration in a balanced sort of way. And so the 5 are this: equality of representation by population today, as well as the future population growth and how that will affect the quality of representation tomorrow. And I'll go through each one of these in detail. The patterns of communication and accessibility, and basically how people move around within the municipality. So you can see we've jumped from numbers to more qualitative things about how we actually live in the community. The geography and the features of geography within the municipality, and the community or diversity of interests. So both groups that have stuff in common and groups that don't have stuff in common, and how we assure overall effective representation for everybody within the system. So these are the 5 principles. I'm going to give you a quick tour of each of them. The first is, it is a basic democratic principle that votes should be more or less equal in weight. So to contribute to this, wards should be designed with relatively equal populations. Now you see I use the word relatively. It's a bit like me telling my daughter that she'll have a relative say into her bedtime or something like that. So you always have to be worried about words like relative when they're used by judges or by consultants. But this is a really important point, because some variation is inevitable. Like, you just can't get away from it. As a practical matter, residents are always coming and going. And it's impossible to keep ward populations perfectly equal. So we don't get so fussed about the numbers that we become crippled by the practical unreality of being able to keep numbers perfect. So as soon as you decided that they don't have to be exactly the same, how equal do they have to be? And so the court doesn't just say that it is an inevitable thing that you have to have some variation. They also say that it's probably desirable, because you want to be able to promote effective representation given the characteristics of the municipality. So there's no hard and fast rule for how much variation, how much relativity among the sizes of the wards is appropriate. But in Ontario, it has become generally accepted that wards should not vary from the average by more than 25% in population, unless there's a good reason to do so. So you see, even there, they say 25% plus or minus, unless there is a good reason to do so that relates to providing overall effective representation. And, if you've ever wondered why some of the ridings in our parliament, so that are, up in the far north, don't necessarily have the same as some of the ridings in the urban, it's a sort of a practical reality that when you're dealing with geography and representation that's effective, you maybe have to have some flexibility. So this is the numeric one, and it's the equality of representation today. And its cousin is the second one, which, as I already said, we're not just designing wards for today. We want them to last for a reasonable period of time. That's 10 years commonly. That's sort of the least amount of time that you typically design them for. And that's what we were instructed to do in our terms of reference. So we're looking at where the population of Grimsby is today and where it's going to be in 10 years. And we're trying to respect that plus or minus 25%, not just now, but then. So we got to, like Mr. Gretzky would say, we have to think about where the population is going to be, not just where it is today. And so that is an exercise in not just in counting, but in forecasting as well. So that's an interesting challenge. So the third one to consider, and now we're out of the numbers, it's whether there are any factors relating to transportation or communication patterns that could affect ward design. So how people actually live in the community and move around and access municipal services is something that we're supposed to consider in designing effective representation. And, this can sometimes be of greater significance in really large ridings where the people on the one side, rarely visit the other, or, like the people on one end go to Ottawa and the people on the other end come to Toronto, and, there's nothing in between. So you'd want to ask yourselves whether this is a really important factor in Grimsby, given its relatively compact size and geography. Then there's geographical and topographical features. So these can either be natural things like rivers or creeks or the escarpment or the lake, which are huge facts in the way in which people live in Grimsby. But they can also be human-made, like highways. Like, I know that QE is a huge factor in dividing Grimsby kind of, I won't say in two because it's hardly even, but it's certainly a divider. And there's many of the other streets that go up and down the escarpment that are very practical and visible and easy to understand. So that consideration of practical boundaries and easy to understand boundaries I think one of our guests tonight, I think it was Marilyn, who mentioned that the words are kind of confused and not so easy to follow. So that can be a factor in designing what we call effective representation. And then finally, a couple of you have talked about the importance of recognizing or being able to manage diversity. And so effective representation, and this can cut in two ways. One is there's kind of a principle that words are often drawn to respect, say, traditional communities. And so it's a principle that one ought not to go around dividing up or splitting traditional communities just because of the convenience of the person drawing lines on the map. You should respect those communities and try and keep them intact as much as possible. But at the same time, it's important to not draw boundaries in a way that fails to take into account diversity of interest. And I think at least one or two of you have mentioned already the rural community that's up on the escarpment, and how it's important to not have the math work that any particular community always loses because it's so diluted inside a broader community that it's, say, always split up so many ways that it can't ever get anybody elected because it's always the last 5% of a ward the way it's drawn or something like that. So it's very important to respect both these existing communities and the diversity of interests. And when the court looked at all of this, what they were really trying to say was this: taken together, all 5 of these aspects contribute to effective representation, and they help us give us an overall guide to designing word boundaries. But one thing is like crystal clear, which is while the math, the parity today and the relative parity tomorrow are important, it's not the only factor. And an Ontario court said as recently as a couple of years ago, ward design is not just a purely mathematical exercise. It's not about trying to get it as close as possible and saying we're done. Because the other 3 factors are also quite relevant to determining whether the resulting system actually works or not. So enough from me on the subject. What the questions that I'm going to be asking you next are to get a sense of how you think we're doing in terms of achieving this. I'm sorry, there is a little bit more background I was going to give you, which is just everybody's always interested in the current population estimates because they are so relevant to the first of the 5 principles. And this chart shows you estimates of the population in Grimsby's 4 wards. It is more interesting than you might think when you're this far into a census cycle coming up with the exact population of a community. It's not something that we, like in the off years, it's not something we keep track of. So it's a number that you have to calculate. So these numbers are based on StatCan 2016, which is getting a little bit old. And to account for that, we've added in Grimsby's water metering data to further reflect growth to the end of 2019. We're continuing to refine these numbers. And we're also going to be and we don't have these yet, but we're working on it. We're going to be also doing projections of how Grimsby will grow to 2030. But as you can see, based on these numbers, which we think are getting pretty darn close, the average population per ward is 7,584, which is basically what you get when you divide 30,335 into 4. And so as you see, there's 4 wards, 2 councillors per ward for a total of 8. Here are the average populations. And as you can see, their variance from average, you got Ward 4, which is already too big. And you got Ward 3, which is right on the edge of what's acceptable in terms of being underweight in terms of population. So your council was right. It is necessary to take a look at this because you already have a level of variance here, which is probably, unless it's justified by some other measure, it's probably getting a little bit out of hand. So what I have now are 4 slides, and I'll just go through them very quickly, and then you're welcome to give me your comments on the functioning of them. I've got one for each of the 4 wards, and I'll just give you a quick introduction to them. This is Ward 1. It's got about 25% of the population, which means, you know, it is almost perfect. It's only got a 1% variance from the average. And this is the one that takes into account with the Grimsby Beach area and goes just up to the, partway up towards the escarpment. This is Ward 2, which has half of the escarpment lands and sort of an odd chunk of the area down here, puzzle piece like that gets in, surrounding into the downtown area. It's light in its population, Ward 3 has 19% of the total population, so it's also light. It's the one that has the established lakefront area as well as part of the downtown. And then, as a couple of you have already mentioned, this is Ward 4. It's the one that's got the massive growth going on down in these areas down here, with more to come. This is really, transforming this part of Grimsby. As you can see, its variance is plus 37%, so it's kind of significantly out of whack. So I'm interested in any comments that you have on the wards that as it relates to any of the factors that I described to you, like whether you think the wards are effective the way they are, whether you're troubled by their size, whether there's boundaries that you would like to draw to my attention, or ways in which you think they don't work. It's kind of wide open and over to you. And if you tell me what ward you're interested in commenting on, and if it's all 4 of them, then that's fine. I'll jump over to a map of all 4. If you'd like to focus on any of the specific wards, I'm happy to jump there. So anybody care to start? Tell me what you think about the current overall structure of the wards. Bud is first.
Just a comment on the sizes, general geographical size of the wards. Ward 4 is overly large. Ward 3 and Ward 1 are comparable size, but the population in Ward 4 is going to completely swallow us over here in Ward 3.
I guess a dwarf is probably
that's the word. Thank you.
The right word. It's probably not the right word either. Will dramatically outpace, I guess.
And it's still coming.
Other comments? Howard.
Yes. When I moved to Grimsby about 1.5 years ago, it shocked me the fact that I almost thought that the wards, when they were set up the way they are, were almost gerrymandered, to use that American term, to include the existing development, the urbanized area right along the lake, and then it goes all the way up to the far reaches of the escarpment area, which is a very different world. And I find that very disturbing, because I don't think the people up in the escarpment get the same type of representation that people down below do. And I guess there was an attempt to combine when the town was rearranged in the 90s. I guess the attempt was to incorporate the people that were forcefully put into the town, and the result is I think the wards are discombobulated. They don't make any sense to me. I would like to see the area up on the escarpment have its own representation. It has its own requirements, and it has a different type of development patterns, etc. So that's the prime thing I would like to see come of all this is the escarpment should have a separated representation, different ward up there, and with someone that can focus on the needs and the constituents up on the mountain. And
would you?
The configuration of the other wards are they're all, it's as though someone drew a wild pencil diagram and just put them all together. For me, they don't make any sense in terms of development patterns, of age of the community. I don't understand the rationale for the wards as they exist today. And that's why I think this process that we're into now hopefully would rectify that whole process. The end result will be a ward system that better reflects the values and the diversity, as people have mentioned already.
Can I just ask, when you're thinking about Ward 4, or sorry, the escarpment ward, would you see it kind of covering the entire area? Or?
Yes, I would think because of the I don't know what the exact population is up there, but there should be a separate ward that is focused on the top of the mountain, the escarpment, because it is largely different development patterns. I think there's a different population up there to large extent. The properties, some of the properties are enormous, and some of them are much smaller historically. But there's a lot of super duper housings up there, and there's a lot of remnants of agricultural activity. So I think it requires a separate focus rather than to combine it with the rest of the town.
Okay. So one of the great things about doing this digitally is I can just create a new one. Anybody else want to comment? You can have fun drawing your own boundaries too, so we don't have to have them go on top of one another. Who would like to go next? Oh, yeah, Bud?
Just as a comment, I think the rural, incorporating the rural communities on the mountain and giving them their own voice would make more sense than the way they are separated out, but still part of.
You agree.
Who's next?
It's Rita here, Rita Middleton. I want to echo Howard's comments. It was very eloquently said. We live up on the mountain. My concern is that currently Ward 4 is so huge, and that the person that's actually representing us does not necessarily live in the rural community. They could very well be down in a very dense area down in near the lake. So it needs to be somebody that actually understands our needs and understands the issues.
So you guys are giving us all a master class in principle number 5 from effective representation, which is about diversity of representation and community of interest here, and sort of focusing on that. But it is interesting how in the last comment, you were also kind of highlighting the linkage between the relative population parity question and how that can sometimes make it difficult to get effective representation in an area that's a small piece of a larger place. So thank you for that. You're all kind of demonstrating what the Supreme Court was talking about. Rita, I guess you're next.
No, that was me. I just spoke.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. Who would like to go next? Jennifer.
This was not my idea. I think it was presented the first night, but I did like it. If the ward boundaries went kind of in a line from the lake to the escarpment, so every ward had lakefront, they had heritage, and they had escarpment, then every ward would have a vested interest in everything that's important to us in town. Now, I do agree that the escarpment probably needs representation that they don't get. So if you wanted to do that one further, you could cut the wards then in half and have 6 wards with 1 councillor.
So first, I'm just trying to catch up with the
I think this was presented the first night.
Yeah.
My only fear with separating is we get a divided community. Like right now we have Grimsby on the lake and we have Grimsby. So if we have a whole separate ward of the escarpment, it's almost seen as a separate community, almost like before when we had, North Grimsby and South Grimsby. This, I think, kind of brings the community together as still a whole community.
Right. So there it is with 5, and please, you can see I'm just moving boxes, right? Like there's don't take anything specific from them. I'm just trying to keep up with the commenter.
You can even have 3 wards instead of the 4 across. Have 3 across.
Mm-hmm. Look at that. I swear, it's the one nice thing about COVID is doing these things digitally instead of in person. It actually probably is more flexible for this kind of activity than it would be if we were in a big room together in front of a flip chart. So this would be a kind of a 4-ward alignment.
Yeah. I mean, if the escarpment wanted their own representation, if not, they felt you could just instead of having separate, just have the 3 across, right? And then have 2 per.
So, okay, hang on a sec. You see how much fun this is. Like you can play with this all night. And of course, then you have to do the math. And our job isn't to do the math right now. Our job right now, because we'll do that. That's what you might call Strategy Corp's homework. Our job is to just hear from you concepts about what you think might work, what might make sense. And then, but you know, like you don't know, and I know you don't know exactly how many people are going to be moving into this rapid growth area down here. And obviously we'd have to do the math to figure out just how small Ward 4 would, or sorry, not Ward 4, but just how small this ward would have to be in order to make sense. That's our job. But but these concepts that you all are tossing out are very helpful to us as we think about what it might look like. Happy to hear any other suggestions that you think are worthy of investigation.
It's Rita again.
Okay.
I had one issue with the last comment in that it really doesn't represent what I had mentioned earlier, where it's quite likely in that 3-ward scenario where all of the representatives or the councillors are from in town, and they don't necessarily then represent the interests of the rural community. We need somebody that actually lives and breathes the issues up on the escarpment and can properly represent them.
Rural area would not tend to elect representatives. And so you'd actually wind up, by being sliced 3 ways, you'd wind up being dominated by what's going on down by the more lake or midtown based interests, I guess. Is that a fair way to capture it? Other comments? Sorry, Bud, go ahead.
That's fine. Just in looking at the population as it stands and the way it's going to grow down by the water, I think the idea of having a mountain escarpment rural riding or ward rather, where we have representatives elected from that area in an effort to try to balance out the weight of the ones that are down below the mountain, I think is a more fair way to go about it.
3 across.
And 3 across the top.
3 across the waterfront.
Across the lake, yeah, 3 across
So
the top.
that's actually back to this model here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
So can I ask, this is something that I'm very curious about. From a point of view of the interests of people who are on the escarpment, how far down the escarpment can you go before you no longer have the feel of the escarpment? Like, are people? It's been said to me, not in one of the public meetings, but by someone who was speaking to us, who said that to be on top of the escarpment is to be very focused on the escarpment and to think about the Niagara Escarpment Commission and the land use rules, and to be on the slope of the escarpment or just below it is also to be very focused on it. And so they were urging that it's not just the brow of the escarpment, but that folks who are sort of partway down this way actually have a lot in common. And, you know, I found that interesting because the pure upper part of the escarpment is a little bit light in population. And it's of interest to me what you folks would think about if I were to say, well, how about we push this down a little bit further to sort of get some of the population that's here. Is that like a totally different planet? Would that like make the same mistake of dominating the interests of the upper escarpment people? Or is there something in common by people who are on the slope, the lower slope of the escarpment with people who are on the upper slope? I'm just asking, I don't have any view on this. I'm curious what you think. Marilyn?
I guess I just wonder about unintended consequences of creating a urban rural dichotomy. If there's a ward that's just people from one specific, the advantages are clear that the voice gets heard, but how well does it get heard if the other 3 are all more urban focused? So do you,
Right.
The consequence being, do you have and I don't mean it in a pejorative sense, but do you have a ghetto? if the rural ward is just not connecting with the developed parts of the town, and it's all one town, and people travel throughout the town, we go up and down the mountain all the time. So I don't know. I worry that maybe their voice will get lost if there isn't someone who's representing, both the urban and the rural.
Now, that was a great answer, but I would just point out that you neatly avoided answering my question. And so I'm still interested in my question, but I also really liked what you just shared. So nobody's obligated to answer my question, but I am really curious about what guidance you have for me on this, because I'd like to know. It's the area that is sort of, broadly speaking,
Well, I'm a resident on the lake, and I travel up the mountain regularly because there's great things up there. Great park, the view, places I go. There's the cemetery. There's reason for me to traverse all the way across the entire boundaries of the town, east, west, north, south, and part of it is how people travel and move. So I like both, and being on the lake and also going up on the escarpment, and so that's just a personal example of how I don't see myself as being confined to downtown because I happen to live along the lake.
Other thoughts on this, or anything else you want to share? Like, it's kind of wide open.
I have one, John. It's Kristen at Jeff's iPad.
Mm-hmm.
When we were talking about, a ward that's just above the top of the escarpment, like up on the flatlands, I was thinking that is a good idea because that is sort of uniquely rural. But we live at the base of the escarpment, and, we have a lot of the same concerns with the folks that live up there. And just because we're at the base of the escarpment doesn't, mean that we're really that different from them. And we do have some of the same concerns about the escarpment and how it is specifically as managed traffic noise. So I think in direct answer to your question, I don't think it's just at the crest of the escarpment that we need to look. It's all of the people who live in direct connection to the escarpment may share similar concerns.
Thank you. There you go. That is a great direct answer to my question. So thank you.
But again, we have not been here for that long, but we have not seen issues discussed at City Council that only affect the escarpment community.
Mm-hmm.
They're Grimsby wide. And as the last person just said, it's a small town. We all go up and down the escarpment all the time. We go to the beach, we go to town. Do we really need to be divided into little specific types of communities, or are we all one community that just needs to be effectively represented?
Okay, I'm just trying to catch up to you here. Anybody want to go next? Bud.
This is a comment. It would seem to me like we've been here for nearly 40 years, and we do a lot less up the mountain, even though we like it up there. We enjoy the beamers and all of that. But I would suggest that we living down here do much less traversing up the mountain than the people who live up on the mountain do down to Grimsby because of services and so forth.
And I'm sorry, but are you down by the lake, or?
Yes, we are. We're in 3.
Ward 3.
Yeah. Other thoughts? Please don't wait for me. I'm just trying to catch up. That was an interesting thought, and it was taking me a second to figure out how to capture it. But I think I'm going to capture it as the Ward 3 folk are less likely to go up than the escarpment folks are to come down to consumption, or due to the way travel and services in daily life. Don't be alarmed by my bad typing. I will fix it later.
You should see mine.
Yeah. Other thoughts? So actually, you have come up with, in this one, that's your direct reference to effective representation principle number 3, right? The means of communication and accessibility. But it's just kind of interesting, if we just go back and look at those again for a second, the 5. I mean, it's very easy to get overwhelmed by the numbers and get focused on current population and future population. But, you know, all the talk about ensuring that there's an appropriate focus on the overarching needs of the community versus making sure that nobody gets underrepresented by virtue of the way in which their representatives are elected, and the tension between using wards to do that or using at large to do that. You've had given me lots of good comments on this. The escarpment is kind of like the great fact on the ground that divides things. So you've talked about topography and geography. And in that last comment, we were getting into the way people move around the municipality. So as I've said before, there may be a future for all of you in the Supreme Court of Canada, because you're all kind of hitting on the same factors that the court did in defining effective representation. Well, I don't know if that inspires you to give me any other advice on design of things. Any other thoughts on, say, representation of the downtown area? Howard made the point that it did seem a bit puzzle piece-ish in its design. Are there any issues around this area that you direct me to? Because I mean, I think we've covered the upper and lower escarpment issues. Is there anything relating to the downtown that you have in mind?
Only that Ward 3 is too small and Ward 4 is too big, which we already said, right?
Sorry, I couldn't hear you there. Yeah, go ahead.
That was me. I'm Bud's wife. I'm Eva. We just mentioned before that we're in Ward 3. Ward 3 is too small as far as population, and Ward 4 is too big as far as population. And that's part of the reason all this has to be done. I mean, I don't know whether Ward 3 is the way it is, because that's sort of the original town, and then I guess the first residential part, and that's maybe why it's got the weird shape it has. But it's unfortunately, well, it hasn't gotten much bigger, whereas other places have.
Oh, good point. I'm curious, does anybody's life have a focus on this little part of Ward 2 here that's sort of surrounded by 4 and 3, or have any comments on that area or how it might be represented, or this other little puzzle piece that Ward 2 has over here in this part of the downtown area?
Well, I'm wondering whether that part, when we first came here, weren't there greenhouses there?
Yep.
That was sort of agricultural, and well, it's greenhouses at any rate. I mean, now it's residential, at least part of it. I don't know whether that had anything to do with the way things got designed, but that's, like Bud said, we've been here for almost 40 years, so I'm pretty sure that was greenhouses.
Yeah, no, almost certainly. The way things have filled in makes sense, right?
Yeah.
Let me ask a different question. Are any advice about Ward 1 for me, about things to either beware of or think about? Does this feel like one cohesive area, or is this area that Eva was just describing where the greenhouses used to be? Would it make sense to unify this somehow, whether it's with 3 or 1, or does that make sense? Because it's sort of, I mean, I'm a bit with Howard. I have no idea how these were originally generated, but it's just, there's some aspects of it that are, so Annette, go ahead.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's like, because it is all, it doesn't make sense as it is right now. And I live in Ward 1, and I feel that we're gonna have, it's gonna be the next push for development, especially with the mega high school right on the border there. And then several big properties actually have been sold. I have concerns right beside me as far as a new development going in. And I relate to the escarpment. So I have big concerns about development and protecting the escarpment and our natural features. So, and I do have a concern too with Ward 3, especially if anybody's following the local news. Ward 3 doesn't, there's a lot of people that feel that Ward 3 doesn't have any effective representation. So that needs to be addressed.
Other comments? Jennifer?
I live in the one little square in Ward 2. It was cherry orchards and stuff, and now it's townhouses and everything. But I feel the other one.
The bigger one.
Yep. What if just kind of, if we went back to the wards going from the lake to the escarpment and only have 3 wards with 2 councillors each, then you'd have 6 councillors, and then put 2 councillors at large, one specific for the escarpment and one specific for the down the escarpment lake area.
So if they're at large, they're at large. So you couldn't have them be at large and specifically designated, but if you had, yeah, I think you have to be either ward or you have to be at large, but I don't think you can be like the honorable member for the escarpment, or, you know, the person elected at large with special responsibility for the escarpment or something like that. You know, de facto, people can assume that kind of function, but there's no formal way to do that through electoral structure, I don't think. I mean, I guess what's interesting about that, you know, Ward 4 as a practical matter would have to be shrunken, I guess, because there's going to be so much weight down here. And so if you did want to go to a simple sort of 3-ward model, you know, I'm guessing it would probably look something more like that. I mean, don't hold me to any of this because the number modeling is what would need to be done. And in fact, you could probably do a version, I'm afraid I don't have an L shape here, but you could probably do a version where, you know, this one kind of curves this way. So you might be able to focus the rural representation in 2 of the wards so that they're not all dominated by the lakefront stuff. But, you know, you might be able to do something like that, sort of to have 3 wards, but that's assuming like a 3-ward model to elect 6, or it's potentially, so you can also see the interrelationship between the size of council and like what size you're planning for, and then how many wards you're trying to accommodate them in. So so it's probably worth asking, does anybody have any fresh ideas about the size of council now that they've thought about the wards? Because, you know, in the order of operations, you can think about the size of council and then suit the number of wards, but you can also start trying on for size the different orientation of wards and then say, well, you know, I like 6, or I like 3, or I like 4. Any thoughts on that at all? Well, look, I got a different sort of thought starter question for you, and feel free to come back to the maps because, you know, once you start them, like, you can't ever get away from them. But this is sort of a summary kind of question, and I'd be happy to hear from each of you on it. And the first statement is, like, I'm sure you can see that there's many possible ways, and frankly, many legitimate ways to draw new ward boundaries for a relatively straightforward piece of geography like Grimsby. And so the real question is, there isn't a right answer or a wrong answer. The question is, what's important to you? And as you can see, there's several different options here, and I'd be very interested in hearing from you about what you think. One is to focus on what you might say, let's preserve the status quo or tweak the status quo, but let's not have change for the sake of change. Let's adjust, not totally redraw. Another principle would be to say, look, let's ensure that each vote is weighted as equally as possible. And by the way, these principles aren't necessarily mutually exclusive. You could mix and match these in a way that you think best. You could say, let's respect established communities and not divide communities of interest or established neighborhoods. You could say, let's reflect transportation and service patterns and how people move around and consume services within the community, whatever they might be. Let's make them easy to understand. Let's not have them be so confusing that people have no idea which ward they're in and not know who to turn to for help. Or let's not have the accountability of councillors be so blurred because of no one knows who's responsible for Main Street because everyone's responsible for Main Street or something like that. That's another way you can think about it. Another way you can think about it is, let's make sure that we continue to deliver rural representation. Or if your view is that you don't currently have good rural representation, you can say, let's deliver it in a way where we achieve fair rural representation. Or you can also encourage a Grimsby-wide view. And that you say that wards should include a variety of geographies and neighborhoods and perspectives. And that might lead you to the layer cake model that we've been kind of talking about here, whether it's got 3 that are sliced this way or whether it's got 6 that are sliced this way. But the idea would be get as many possible who have the full perspective of the place from the lake to the escarpment. So there's lots of different principles. I'm just curious, based on everything we've been talking about, what do you think? What principles are you more attracted to? Go ahead, Howard.
Yes, well, one thing that really bothers me is that the existing boundaries, existing wards are illegible. There's no rhyme or reason to it. And I think what I'd like to see come about is more legibility to the ward system. And also, another aspect that's important is the history. When I was in geography class many years ago, Grimsby was always pointed out a very unique situation. It's a linear conurbation, which is very unique in Canada. It's for the population. It's spread out in a long line, and it was always developed that way. And there's a natural pattern of development that has occurred along that linear concept. And I'd like to see the structure, the town structure, more reflective of that. The existing town that we have now is it's an artificial construct. It was a forced amalgamation by the province quite a few decades ago, where they joined the lower town and the upper town, and they made this new town. And it's easy enough to pass legislation to make that happen, but in reality, I don't think it ever has happened properly. There still are 2 different places for me, and it's important, I think, that the elected representatives reflect that dichotomy to some extent. So I like to see the prime goal for me is to improve the legibility of the town's electoral system, because it's not very apparent. And I live in Ward 2, and it's almost like a little. The line was drawn very arbitrarily to include this part and that part, and I don't understand the rationale behind the current ward boundaries. It doesn't make much sense to me. So I think it's important that we work towards a new ward system that is more legible, that's more easy to understand and easier to provide services and better reflect the values and development patterns and everything else.
And just to sort of, that point you were making about the linear conurbation is really interesting. That's sort of emphasizing the connectivities of the municipality that go this way.
That's right.
Yeah, along the shoreline, which is not surprising. And you can see the dominant, human features of the railway.
That's right. From my recollection, it was always shown to be the very unique in development patterns across the country, where the town developed in a very narrow strip because of course, the geographical factors of the escarpment and when the railway was put in. So there's an historical aspect to that I think is important, because it follows that the town looks and exists the way it is because of that factor. And I'd like to see the electoral system better reflect that as well.
It's an interesting point. And it sort of makes it very, if you will, transgressive to think about dividing up the boundaries this way.
Yes, absolutely.
And it's interesting how the one would reflect history and the natural flow of people and goods along the major arteries, and the other is almost saying, well, yeah, but to heck with that. Let's try and create something that deliberately is cross-cutting to make sure that we don't leave people in their own independent worlds not communicating with each other. So it's fascinating how, like, without choosing which is the right way to go, just commenting on the dichotomy between the two. It's an interesting situation. Okay. Kirsten is Jeff's iPad, I think.
Hi, I was thinking about that, doing the layer cake just slices through the community model to get more diversity within each ward. But I was thinking, if I were going to run for council and the slice wards included a couple of high-rise buildings, I would just focus on those two, because that's where all the votes are. And I wouldn't waste my time driving around the top of the escarpment trying to get votes there. So I actually think it's a good idea, but I'm sort of playing the devil's advocate with myself and thinking there could be unintended consequences with doing that.
Precisely was my point earlier. It's read.
And could I just ask before you move on, did you have any other thoughts about the principles? Because I'm not sure that what you just said is clearly reflecting one of them, unless it's continuing to deliver rural representation. But why don't you tell me what your principles are rather than me trying to guess from the important point that you just made. Okay. Is she gone?
Are you talking to me, Kristen?
Yeah.
Hi. I think you need to have elements of the community that are relatively similar grouped together because we have a similar feeling, perhaps. So we talked about above and below the escarpment. We obviously have Grimsby Beach. There's sort of the downtown and the suburban areas around the immediate downtown, and maybe the new and growing Grimsby on the lake. So you have sort of people who are used to a high-rise living, people who have heritage district concerns, people who have escarpment concerns, and lakefront concerns are sort of grouped together in, even though we're all one community and we drive around and, it's a small community, maybe those similar concerns can be grouped together.
And so that's respecting the established communities, I think, is probably the other principle that you're kind of hitting on.
I think so, but I still like the Grimsby wide view too, because I my observation is we deal with things on a Grimsby wide basis most of the time.
Yeah, and don't worry, these aren't votes; these are just reminders that people made reference to it. So it's not like she just got 4 votes as if she was in some sort of small word here. Don't worry, this is an electoral process here. Everything is appropriate. Other comments?
We need the vote too, right?
Bud, did you? Yep, go ahead.
Yeah, just back to here we have a huge difficulty here with the geography, with the needs of the various sections of the town, but we also have to have some sort of semblance of balance of votes, so that we don't have one area outweighing another just simply because of the size of the vote. A
reasonable balance on the numbers.
Yep.
So So it's not so much that each vote is weighted as equally as possible, but it's achieve a balance. So I think you're sort of advocating the Supreme Court of Canada's view. It's of due regard for the numbers while considering the other factors. Is that fair?
Yeah, that's fair. What I'm thinking is what we may have to do is just wipe all the ward boundaries off and start again.
That would make a lot of sense.
Other comments? Anybody who hasn't spoken yet care to chime in? I really appreciate all our frequent flyers, but I want to make sure everybody feels welcome to kick in. I'm just curious. Is there anything about what we've talked about tonight that kind of changed your perspective from before you came in, or something that you think is, you know, anything that was sort of interesting that you heard tonight that made you say, well, you know, I hadn't thought of that, but that's like a kind of important thing that really should be considered in the review? No.
Rural representation.
Okay. Adam, I think you just raised your hand too.
Yeah, originally I was thinking about the sort of the north to south division of wards, but as other people have said, rural representation is important. I do like the idea that the escarpment wards go below, north of the escarpment to actually capture the people at the base. Because I think if you have to distribute based on population, you need to sort of bump those numbers up to make sure you're sort of equaling everything out.
Mm-hmm. Marilyn, did you have something you wanted to add?
Well, I'll just anecdotally say that when I was a child and my parents believed in child labor, I got to pick cherries along the lake, and now I live in a house that's very residential along the lake. So I guess I'm just being a little cute by half, but change is inevitable, and Grimsby has grown and flexed its expanded muscle quite significantly since I first came here as a child. And now I live in a neighborhood which was built by a cooperative, and I remember my parents telling me how, the people who live downtown didn't think anybody should live over in the ghetto, which is on the lake. And today it's one of the more attractive, appealing areas to live in for people who come here. And I hear the same about the beach area, how people love to come and see the painted houses, and then they get to go up on the escarpment and look down on the town. And the downtown's so important, and it kind of gets left out sometimes because people think about the growth to the east or the west and what's going on the escarpment. But the downtown needs to be kept very alive and vibrant as well in order to be the heart of the town as well. So the other thing I've heard, and as someone who lives across from downtown, I often hear people in the downtown saying, oh, they don't like to go across the QEW, but I don't even notice it. I just walk downtown. And so I guess the point of all of that is that there's a diversity of opinions, and depending upon your personal history and your own patterns of how you live, there are many, many variables that go into this. So I'm glad to see there's such a diversity of opinion and experiences being brought to bear on this process.
Other comments? Kirsten, I think you're back.
Actually, it's Jeff this time.
Uh-oh.
One of the questions I have in my mind, and whether it's on the table here or not, is for the number of wards that one wants to design within the town, is there a general acceptance that the counselor positions will be either part-time or full-time?
Well, it's interesting you say that. I think there is a general acceptance that the demand and the current compensation is in the sort of part-time zone, and we certainly weren't given anything in our terms of reference that would take a look at that. I think you'd find that you tend to get to a larger size municipality before you start to move to full-time counselors, but it's a very good question that you're asking, because it considers one of the other variables. One of the things that we do, and it's a common part of ward boundary reviews, is where we do the interviews with each of the sitting members of council. We just talk to them about their existing workload and assess whether the workload has grown to the point where it's becoming unmanageable, or whether it's requiring a kind of a need for transition. And I think generally, at least, the overarching perception is that part-time continues to be appropriate for the moment. But
right. In the universe of comparables that you showed initially, were those all part-time positions?
You know what? I would hazard a guess that the answer is yes. I can't think of it. I can't think of anybody that would be in that population range.
No, I'll do
it. Yes, go ahead.
That made me think, do councillors have to live in the ward that they represent?
No, it's considered electorally favorable to do so. Like, in other words, easier to get yourself elected and go door to door, but it isn't a requirement.
Thank you.
If I may, that's unfortunate.
Kirsten, is that you on Jeff's iPad with another question, or is your hand still just up? Okay.
I'm sorry.
No, don't apologize. I just didn't want to not respond if you were back. Other comments? So on balance then, any of the, just one last question, just to sort of see if there's any other opinions that you want to get out. Are there any principles here that you think are not important, or just like wrong track, or not really relevant to the realities of Grimsby? No takers on that one? So these are generally the right sorts of considerations, but not necessarily, is that Kirsten or Jeff?
It's Kristen. I think given what I've heard everyone talk about, it seems like the way we travel and move around the city is not as important, because we all go to the same Canadian Tire, we all go downtown, we go to the same GO station. So maybe that's a lesser weighted consideration.
What about the change for its own sake one? Like, I've heard a couple of people say, well, somebody said we should wipe them all out and start again. Is that kind of a repudiation of no change for its own sake? Or is because on the one hand, Howard mentioned the importance of history, which, puts him in pretty good company, because the Supreme Court of Canada said that's important too. But on the other hand, the current boundaries may not really reflect good history, so that isn't necessarily a thing. But should we be cautious about making change, or is change? Go ahead.
I think it's pretty obvious to me that adjusting them isn't going to do it. They do have to be redrawn. So and that's not. That's not necessarily no change for the sake of change. It's because of the need for change that they're going to have to be redrawn.
Right. So no easy tasks for us then, though.
Way more complicated than I thought it was before we took part in this.
Well, that's okay. And Kristen, are you back, or Jeff?
No, I'm not sure why our hand keeps going up. I wouldn't call it change for the sake of change. I would call it change because change is long overdue.
Okay, and Annette?
Yes, I agree with that. It's like we definitely need to make a change, and hopefully it gets implemented before the next election.
Certainly. That's certainly the plan.
Yeah, and with respect, for the established communities is not dividing up, say, our Grimsby Beach community or the downtown community. It's very important as well.
Historical. Jennifer?
I just want to agree with that. I just think we need to look at, it's one thing to have two counselors in your ward representing you. It's another thing for them to be part of a group of 9. So like if you have just the downtown as a ward, are you going to still be fairly representative in a group of 9 voting, right? Like for rural, I would be afraid that if you had a ward that was just up on the escarpment and you had 2 counselors up there, when they get into a council meeting and they're voting on things, do they still have a voice, or are they outnumbered by the counselors down the mountain?
Right. And so does that kind of get at the requirement to encourage a sort of a Grimsby wide view?
I think it's something that has to be considered at least, right? When you're in that group voting situation, is every ward still have a voice, or are there going to be things that override other areas?
Well, and that's the interesting paradox about it all, because the way we design the wards and the way we put together the structure is just one of the things that contributes to the ultimate mix of how a council works together, and how they ultimately decide to work and collaborate and participate and take a community-wide view, even though they come from various places. That's something that falls to the leadership and individual initiative of the people who wind up serving. So the nice thing is the structure is an important contribution to the overall thing, but the people are the ones who bring it to life. Any other comments? Well, look, you've given me most of what I think I could have ever hoped for from a pleasant conversation with a bunch of people about this on a Monday night. So unless anyone has anything else to say, I can turn it back to the mayor and to Sarah. But I just want to really thank you because that was a really, really terrific conversation, and I really appreciate wonderfully civil you all were, and how engaged you all were, and how tremendous your input was. I should just ask, Olivia, you didn't manage to dig up the municipality that has the 16 councillors off our list, did you?
No, sorry, still trying to, what's the name of the individual?
Oh, it was Howard.
Looking for that?
It was Howard. Howard, we could probably send you an email back.
Howard, yeah. If you private message me your email, I can send that over to you later tonight.
Okay, that's fine. Thank you.
Didn't want to fail to get back to you on that. It was such a good question. So otherwise, thank you again. Terrific feedback. And I also just want to thank the councillors who participated as well. It's certainly great leadership there being here to participate in this, and we really appreciate it on the consulting team side. But probably the hardest thing when you're a counselor in a situation like this is sitting on your microphone button and realizing that tonight was all about hearing from the members of the public. But it's terrific that they were here to join us in this, and we really appreciate their support, because there have been a lot of meetings like this and a lot of comments that I've given that have been repetitive that they've had to sit through. So thank you very much, Mr. Mayor, and members of your council for joining us tonight. So over to you, Mr. Mayor.
Oh, before he does, I did that. It's Prince Edward County.
Oh, okay. Well, that explains it. Prince Edward County,
Okay. Thank you very, very much. Thank you.
amalgamated single tier, so a bit of a
And a bit of a disaster, but that's another story.
yeah, exactly. Not something to emulate.
There we go. All right. Well, thank you very much for your presentation, John, and thank you everyone for your fulsome discussion tonight. Lots of interesting viewpoints, and very good to get the most input we can on this. Definitely very interesting. I was at all three, and all three were very interesting. So thank you everyone, and have a good evening.
Thank you, Jeff.
Thank you.
Good night.
Good night.
Night all.
Right.